December 7th, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. But while the world watched Pearl Harbor burn, few understood the truth behind the attack. This wasn't a show of strength, this was desperation. Every bomb that fell, every torpedo that struck, every aircraft that roared across the Hawaiian sky was part of a gamble, not to defeat America, not even to cripple it, but to buy time to seize something Japan needed more desperately than victory itself: oil. The story of Japan's Pacific War doesn't begin at Pearl Harbor. It begins in the oil fields of Sumatra and Borneo, in the refineries of Palembang and Balikpapan, in the thick black crude pumping from beneath the tropical soil of the Dutch East Indies. That oil was Japan's lifeline, and without it every ship in the Imperial Navy would become a floating tomb, every Zero fighter would become a museum piece, every tank would rust into silence. Japan's entire war machine ran on a fuel it didn't have, and that single fact shaped every decision, every battle plan, every desperate move that led to Pearl Harbor and beyond. To understand how an empire could stake its survival on one resource it didn't possess, you have to go back to when Japan was transforming itself from an isolated island nation into an industrial power. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan had modernized with breathtaking speed. It had built factories, railways, and most importantly, a navy that could challenge any power in the Pacific. But there was a problem baked into Japan's very geography. The islands had almost no oil. Few wells at Niigata and Akita produced maybe 2.7 million barrels a year. That was roughly 0.1% of world production. For a modern military machine, it was a joke. So Japan did what it had to do. It imported. By 1941, Japan was importing 90% of its oil. And here's where the math got terrifying. 80% of that imported oil came from one source, the United States of America. The very nation Japan was eyeing as its greatest potential enemy was also its primary fuel supplier. It was an impossible situation. Japan was building a navy to challenge American dominance in the Pacific while depending on American oil to float that navy. It was like building a gun to shoot someone while buying all your ammunition from them. Japanese military planners knew this was madness, but they had no choice. The Japanese Navy, understanding this vulnerability better than anyone, had been stockpiling oil since just after World War I. They did it secretly, desperately, even diverting funds meant for naval construction to buy oil instead. They hid this from their own government. Between 1925 and 1930, money earmarked for battleships quietly vanished into oil purchases. By 1934, the government passed the Petroleum Industry Law, forcing civilian oil companies to maintain reserves equal to half their annual imports. Every drop mattered. Every barrel counted. By March 1941, Japan had managed to stockpile approximately 42.7 million barrels of oil. It sounds like a lot. It wasn't. Here's the calculation that kept Japanese admirals awake at night. That stockpile could supply Japan's needs for about 2 years. But that was peacetime consumption. If Japan went to war, if the Imperial Navy sorted its battleships and carriers, if the Air Force flew constant missions, that 2-year supply became less than 1 year. Maybe as little as 6 months. The Imperial Japanese Navy was burning 2,900 barrels of oil every single hour. Every hour. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. And then, in July 1941, the clock stopped entirely. Japan had been at war with China since 1937. That conflict had devolved into a brutal stalemate that consumed resources without end. The United States, Britain and the Netherlands watched with growing alarm as Japanese forces pushed deeper into Asia. When Japan moved into northern French Indochina in 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt restricted exports of aviation fuel, scrap iron and steel to Japan. But he held back on a total oil embargo. He knew what that would mean. Then in July 1941, Japan made its fatal move. Japanese forces occupied southern Indochina. It was a calculated gamble to put pressure on China and position forces for potential moves south. But it crossed a red line. Southern Indochina put Japanese bombers within striking distance of British Malaya, Singapore and the Philippines. It put them within reach of the Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt could no longer hold back. On July 26th, he issued Executive Order 8832, freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed suit. On August 1st, the United States announced a complete embargo on oil exports to Japan. In Tokyo, the news hit like a bomb. Japan had just lost access to nearly 90% of its imported oil, not reduced, eliminated. The oil gauge and the clock now stood side by side, both pointing towards zero. Japanese planners pulled out their calculations and did the math again, hoping for a different answer. There wasn't one. Without new sources of oil, Japan had about 18 months before the strategic reserve ran completely dry. The Navy had maybe a year of operations left. The Air Force even less. After that, Japan's entire military would simply stop. Battleships would sit at anchor. Carriers would be unable to launch aircraft. The empire would be defenseless. This is where the myth of Japanese aggression meets the reality of Japanese panic. War Minister General Hideki Tojo and the military leadership looked at two options. They could withdraw from China and Indochina, submit to American demands, and accept what they saw as national humiliation. Or they could seize the oil fields they needed before their reserves ran out. There was no middle ground. Doing nothing meant slow death. The military chose the gamble. But here's where the plan became truly audacious. The richest oil fields in reach were in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. These weren't minor deposits. The Dutch East Indies was the fourth largest oil exporter in the world, producing 65 million barrels a year. The fields at Palembang in Sumatra, the refineries at Balikpapan in Borneo, these represented everything Japan needed. Seize these, and Japan could sustain its war machine. The Southern Resource Area, as Japanese planners called it, wasn't just about oil. It had rubber, tin, bauxite, all the raw materials Japan's industry craved, but oil was the prize. However, there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. First, the Dutch East Indies were defended, not heavily, but enough to make a straight invasion risky. Second, the British controlled Malaya and Singapore, which sat right across the invasion route. Third, and most critically, the Philippines stood between Japan and the Dutch East Indies. The Philippines were an American protectorate, garrisoned with American troops and home to American air bases. Any Japanese move south would bring those forces into play. You couldn't invade the Dutch East Indies without dealing with the Philippines, and you couldn't invade the Philippines without bringing America into the war. This is where Admiral Yamamoto enters the story. Yamamoto was one of the most brilliant and conflicted figures in Japanese military history. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than almost any Japanese officer. He knew that in a long war, America would crush Japan. He had told colleagues that in a war with the United States, he might win victories for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence. Yet when the decision for war became inevitable, Yamamoto did his duty, and he proposed something radical. The Japanese Naval General Staff had a war plan. It was called the Decisive Battle Doctrine. The idea was to wait for the American fleet to sail west across the Pacific, attrite it with submarines and air attacks during the crossing, then meet it in a climactic battle somewhere near Japanese waters, where the Imperial Navy fighting close to its bases would have the advantage. It was a defensive strategy, a waiting game. Yamamoto looked at this plan and saw disaster. With Japan's oil reserves draining by the month, a passive strategy was suicide. Waiting gave America time to mobilize its enormous industrial capacity. Waiting meant operations to seize the Dutch East Indies would be vulnerable to American counterattack from the Philippines. Yamamoto proposed something different, something so risky that the Naval General Staff opposed it for 9 months. He proposed attacking the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Not as a climactic battle, but as an opening move, a preventive strike. The idea was brutal in its logic. If Japan was going to war with America anyway, if the seizure of the Dutch East Indies made that war inevitable, then the first move had to be to cripple the American ability to interfere. Take out the battleships at Pearl Harbor, and the US Pacific Fleet would need months, maybe a year to rebuild. That would give Japan time to seize the oil fields, fortify its defensive perimeter, and potentially negotiate a peace before America's full might came to bear. The Naval General Staff hated the plan. It was too risky. The distance to Hawaii was enormous, far beyond anything the Japanese Navy had attempted. The chance of detection was high. If the attack failed, if the carriers were caught en route, it would be a catastrophe. But Yamamoto had one card left to play. In October 1941, as time ran out and the oil embargo squeezed tighter, Yamamoto made his position clear. If the Naval General Staff didn't approve the Pearl Harbor plan in its entirety, he and his entire staff would resign. The threat worked. Admiral Osami Nagano and the Naval General Staff capitulated. The plan was approved. On November 5th, Yamamoto issued Top-Secret Operation Order No. 1 to the combined fleet. The order laid out Japan's entire strategy. The goals were clear: drive Britain and America from Greater East Asia, hasten the settlement in China, establish a self-supporting economic entity centered on the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of Southeast Asia. 2 days later, Yamamoto set the date for the Pearl Harbor attack. December 7th, a Sunday, the day American forces would be least alert. On November 26th, as diplomats in Washington continued futile negotiations, the Pearl Harbor strike force departed Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, carrying over 400 aircraft, 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 oilers for refueling at sea. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled sailed east into the North Pacific, maintaining absolute radio silence. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the force. His orders were clear: if discovered before reaching the launch point, turn back. If negotiations succeeded, turn back. If the attack proceeded, strike with everything. The world knows what happened next. At 7:55 on the morning of December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft hit Pearl Harbor. Torpedo bombers screamed in low over the water. Dive bombers plummeted from the sky. In 2 hours, the US Pacific Fleet was devastated. 5 battleships sunk, 3 damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, over 2,400 Americans dead. The shock reverberated across the world. But here's what most people miss. While the world focused on Pearl Harbor, the real objective was already in motion. Hours before the first bomb fell on Hawaii, Japanese forces invaded Malaya. They landed at Kota Baru and began the lightning campaign that would take them to Singapore in just over 2 months. Simultaneously, Japanese forces struck at the Philippines, Hong Kong, Wake Island, and Guam. These weren't separate operations. They were all part of one plan: seize the southern resource area. Get the oil. Within days, the southern offensive was rolling forward with terrifying speed. General Hisaichi Terauchi commanded the Southern Expeditionary Army Group. Under him, the 16th Army under General Hitoshi Imamura began the systematic conquest of the Dutch East Indies. On December 17th, just 10 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed at Miri in northern Sarawak, Borneo. Miri was an oil production center. The first objective had been reached, but the defenders destroyed the wells before retreating. The Japanese would have to repair them. The plan for taking the entire Dutch East Indies was elegant in its simplicity. 3 prongs, 3 forces moving south. The eastern force would advance from Jolo and Davao, capturing Celebes, Amboina, and Timor, protecting the flank. The center force would take the oil fields at Tarakan Island and Balikpapan in Borneo. The western force had the most critical mission: capture the oil refineries at Palembang in Sumatra. Palembang was the prize. The Royal Dutch Shell refineries at nearby Plajo processed crude from southern Sumatra and produced over 30% of the Dutch East Indies' refined petroleum. Lose Palembang intact and Japan's oil problem was solved. Lose Palembang destroyed, and the entire campaign risked becoming a Pyrrhic victory. On January 11, 1942, Japanese forces took Tarakan Island. Again, the Dutch destroyed the oil fields before surrendering. 700 wells sabotaged. On January 24th, Japanese forces attacked Balikpapan. The refineries there processed 5.24 million barrels annually. They produced aviation gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and lubricating oil. The Pandansari refinery was called the Placety of the Pacific. Again, the Dutch defenders fought a delaying action and destroyed what they could before being overwhelmed. The pattern was clear. The Japanese were winning, but they were inheriting wreckage. Every oil field taken was a damaged oil field. Every refinery captured was a partially destroyed refinery. Dutch defenders, knowing exactly what Japan needed, made sure to deny it as much as possible. This is what made Palembang so critical. If the Japanese could take Palembang intact, they could offset losses elsewhere, but Palembang would be the toughest nut to crack. The Dutch and British forces prepared for the inevitable assault. Lieutenant Colonel LNW Vogelesang of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army commanded the defences in the Palembang area. About 2,000 troops, Home Guard units, artillery positions. The Royal Air Force sent Hurricane fighters. The Royal Australian Air Force sent more. It wasn't much, but it was something. They knew the Japanese were coming. The question was when and how. The Japanese plan for Palembang was audacious. Colonel Seiichi Kume's 2nd Parachute Regiment would drop directly onto the refineries and the airfield at Pangkalan Benteng, securing them before defenders could complete demolitions. Simultaneously, an amphibious force under the 229th Infantry Regiment would sail up the Musi River to land near Palembang. It was one of the largest airborne operations of the war to that point. On the morning of February 14, 1942, as the invasion fleet approached southern Sumatra, Japanese transport aircraft appeared over Palembang. About 180 paratroopers dropped near the Plajo refineries. Another 90 landed near Pangkalan Benteng airfield. The defenders fought back hard. Makeshift counterattacks by landstorm troops and anti-aircraft gunners managed to retake the Plajo refinery complex temporarily. They set the oil stores on fire, but they couldn't completely destroy the facilities. Japanese soldiers entrenched in air raid shelters held on. 2 hours later, another 60 paratroopers dropped as reinforcements. As the fighting raged on land, the naval escort for the invasion fleet fought off Allied air attacks. One British vessel, HMS Lee Wo, a converted riverboat with a single 4-inch gun, attacked the entire Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Thomas Wilkinson and his crew engaged heavy cruisers and transports for 90 minutes before running out of ammunition. Wilkinson ordered his ship to ram the nearest transport. Lee Wo was destroyed, but Wilkinson earned a posthumous Victoria Cross. It was the only Victoria Cross awarded in the entire Dutch East Indies campaign. One small ship against an invasion fleet. It bought minutes, nothing more. Meanwhile, a larger Allied naval force attempted to intercept the invasion. Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman commanded 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers. They turned back after being attacked by Japanese carrier aircraft from the Ryuho and land-based bombers. The Japanese landing forces sailed up the Musi River toward Palembang largely unopposed. On February 15th, Japanese troops began disembarking. By February 16th, Palembang fell. The Japanese had done it. They captured the Plajo refinery largely intact. The Sungai Jurong refinery nearby was 80% destroyed, but it could be repaired. This was the victory Japan needed. But it came at the cost of delay. The refineries weren't producing. They wouldn't be producing for months. Every day without oil from Palembang was another day draining the strategic reserve back home. And the clock kept ticking. The final act in the conquest of the Dutch East Indies played out at sea. As Japanese forces closed in on Java itself, the last major island still unconquered, Admiral Doorman assembled every Allied ship available for one last desperate attempt to stop the invasion. On February 27, 1942, Doorman's combined striking force sailed from Surabaya to intercept a Japanese convoy approaching from the north. Doorman commanded a polyglot fleet. 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Exeter and USS Houston, 3 light cruisers, his flagship HNLS de Ruyter, HLMs Java, and HMAS Perth, 9 destroyers from 4 different navies. It looked formidable on paper. In reality, it was a nightmare of coordination. The ships had never operated together. They had no common communication procedures. Doorman spoke Dutch. The Americans, British, and Australians spoke English. Flag signals differed between navies. Radio procedures were incompatible. Doorman had to relay orders through translators, losing precious seconds in combat. The Japanese force was smaller but unified. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi commanded 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro, 2 light cruisers, 14 destroyers, and they had something the Allies didn't know existed, the Type 93 torpedo, called the Long Lance. It could travel 24 miles at 48 knots. No other torpedo in the world came close. The Allies thought they were out of torpedo range. They were dead wrong. The Battle of the Java Sea began at 4:16 in the afternoon. The two fleets sighted each other and opened fire at long range. For hours the battle raged across the Java Sea. The Japanese heavy cruisers' 8-inch guns hammered the Allied line. At 5:15 Exeter took a shell hit in the boiler room and had to reduce speed. At 5:27 the destroyer Courtenaire was struck by a Long Lance torpedo and broke in half, sinking in seconds. The Allies didn't even know they'd been torpedoed at first. The Japanese were too far away. They assumed submarines. Dorman tried to reorganize, tried to get around the Japanese screen to reach the vulnerable transports. He couldn't. Every time he maneuvered, Japanese destroyers and cruisers blocked him. As darkness fell, the battle became a nightmare of confusion. At 9:25, the British destroyer Jupiter hit a mine and sank. Dorman pressed on with his remaining cruisers, Perth, Houston, De Ruyter, and Java. He refused to break off. He knew what was at stake. If the transports landed, Java was lost. If Java was lost, the entire Dutch East Indies fell. Just after 11 at night, in near total darkness, the Japanese heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro caught Dorman's battered force. They fired their Long Lance torpedoes. The first struck De Ruyter amidships. A massive explosion tore through the flagship. Minutes later, another torpedo hit Java. Both cruisers were doomed. Dorman sent his last signal. All ships were not to stand by survivors, but to make for Batavia. Then Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman went down with his ship, along with 344 of his crew. The Battle of the Java Sea was over. The Allies lost 5 ships and over 900 men. Japanese losses were negligible. 1 destroyer damaged. The transports landed on Java the next day. On March 8th, the Dutch surrendered unconditionally. The entire Dutch East Indies, from Sumatra to Borneo to Java, now belonged to Japan, and with it the oil fields Japan had gone to war to seize. But here's where the plan started to unravel. The Japanese had won the conquest. They had the oil fields, but what they had were damaged oil fields. What they had were sabotaged wells and partially destroyed refineries. In 1940, the Dutch East Indies produced 65.1 million barrels of oil. In 1942, even with repairs underway, the Japanese managed to restore production to just 25.9 million barrels, barely 40% of pre-war levels. By 1943, production reached 49.6 million barrels, about 75% of the original capacity. It sounds like success. In some ways, it was. But there were 2 problems Japanese planners hadn't fully anticipated. First, rebuilding took time Japan didn't have. The 6 months Yamamoto had predicted for success were already running out. At midway in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing 4 fleet carriers. The initiative in the Pacific shifted to America. Second, even with the oil fields producing, getting that oil back to Japan proved nearly impossible. American submarines began an unrestricted warfare campaign against Japanese shipping. At first, it was ineffective, hampered by defective torpedoes and poor targeting. But as 1942 turned into 1943 and then 1944, the American submarine force became devastatingly effective. Japanese tankers, slow and vulnerable, became priority targets. One by one, they were sunk. The oil was there, in Palembang and Balikpapan and Tarakan, but it couldn't get to where Japan needed it. Tanker imports to Japan, which had been 37 million barrels in 1941, dropped to 42 million in 1942 as the captured fields came online, then began a steady, irreversible decline. 44 million in 1943, 25 million in 1944. By 1945, almost nothing. Japan's strategic oil reserves, the stockpile they had built so carefully, began shrinking year by year. 49 million barrels at the start of the war, 38 million in 1942, 25 million in 1943, just 13 million in 1944. The clock they had tried so hard to reset was running out anyway. Major elements of the combined fleet had to be based near Singapore instead of the home islands, because there wasn't enough fuel to move them. Ships sailed on unrefined crude oil when refined products ran out, destroying their engines. Training programs for pilots were cut to nothing because there was no fuel for practice flights. The quality of Japanese naval aviators plummeted. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was, for all practical purposes, dead. Powerful battleships that had cost fortunes to build sat tied to piers, unable to sail for lack of fuel. Carriers that had terrorized the Pacific sat empty, because there was no aviation fuel for their aircraft and no fuel to train the pilots who would have flown them. When American forces invaded Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Japanese Navy offered no resistance. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. They had no fuel. This is the brutal irony of Japan's Pacific War. They went to war for oil. They attacked Pearl Harbor for oil. They conquered the Dutch East Indies for oil. They captured the oil fields they needed. And it didn't matter. The war they started to secure oil became the war that consumed the oil faster than they could pump it. The gamble failed. Not because the planning was bad, not because the execution was flawed. The Japanese military had pulled off one of the most audacious campaigns in history, seizing an empire in 6 months, but the fundamental math never changed. America's industrial capacity was simply too vast. The United States produced 1.35 billion barrels of oil a year. Japan, even with the Dutch East Indies at full production and perfect logistics, could never match that. The submarines that sank the tankers weren't a surprise tactic. They were the inevitable result of America's ability to build more submarines, faster than Japan could build escorts. The carriers that replaced the ones lost at Midway weren't lucky. They were the product of shipyards that could build a fleet carrier in a year. Japan couldn't replace its losses. America could replace its losses and then build more. Yamamoto had known this from the beginning. He had told his colleagues he might win for 6 months to a year. After that, he had no confidence. He was right. Almost to the month. 6 months after Pearl Harbor came Midway. After Midway, Japan never won a major naval victory again. The oil they had fought for, the oil fields of Sumatra and Borneo and Java, became spectators to Japan's slow destruction. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications about Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of the South Pacific. They knew his exact itinerary. They knew his flight path. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the man who had tried to give Japan time to secure the oil it needed, was flying in a bomber over Bougainville. American P-38 fighters were waiting. Yamamoto's plane was shot down. He died instantly. The architect of Japan's gamble never saw how completely it failed. The Japanese fought on for another 2 years. They fought desperately, brilliantly, often with suicidal courage. But they fought without fuel. Without oil, the carriers sat in port. Without oil, the battleships rusted at anchor. Without oil, the empire simply stopped moving. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Among the many reasons cited, the inability to continue the war, the devastating effects of the atomic bombs, the Soviet entry into the conflict, one reason went unspoken. They had run out of oil. The Pacific War was the first energy war of the industrial age. It was a war fought because one nation couldn't produce the resources it needed and gambled everything on taking them from someone else. Every decision Japan made, from Pearl Harbor to the invasion of the Dutch East Indies to the desperate defense of the Mariana Islands, as American forces got within bombing range of the home islands, every single decision traced back to one simple fact. Japan needed oil. They didn't have it. They tried to take it, and the attempt destroyed them. Historians debate the Pacific War endlessly. They analyze tactics and strategies. They dissect battles and campaigns. They examine the decisions made in Tokyo and Washington. But underneath all of it, beneath every argument and analysis, sits one undeniable truth. Japan's entire war plan relied on one thing: Indonesian oil. They got it. It didn't save them, because a war plan built on desperation, no matter how brilliantly executed, is still just desperation. And desperation in the end is not enough.